Welcome to Chatting the Pictures. My name is Cara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm a writer, a psychologist, and also publisher of Reading the Pictures.
Our first segment we call the news, and here we're interested in how news photos tell a story.
This photo was taken by Jonathan Ernst for Reuters. If you're paying any attention to politics at all, you will identify Nancy Pelosi ripping up the transcript of President Trump's State of the Union speech right after he finished delivering it.
We have seen a lot of versions of this picture, a lot of video, a lot of GIFs, a number of things that have been circulating online since the State of the Union. And I want to talk about this particular version because to me, this picture is all about the faces, almost these kind of interior moments. Trump is caught in what I would say is a very unusual posture. And Pelosi, at that moment where she has just ripped a page or two of that speech in half, seems almost absorbed in a kind of private delight.
I spent a lot of time looking at all the different versions of the photo. Depending on the scene, the moment, the angle, you do get all kinds of different emotional and political inflections to the photograph. And this one, I like this one quite a bit because you see the three people almost as if they're in their own pictures. That says so much to me about DC right now also. There's places operating on separate tracks. And then, like you said, Cara, this one photo shows Nancy less angry and more almost bemused. Coming from that position, that's where Nancy Pelosi really is the most effective at making Donald Trump crazy. There are other photographs showing her ripping the speech in half, but none that have this kind of poise to it. And then, of course, there's Trump kind of wondering, like, how did I do? Because everything's performative. And then Mike Pence, the cheerleader.
Pence seems to be the only one who actually knows that he's still on TV, which I find sort of amusing.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you see things like a live soldier reunion, this soldier reuniting with his family on national television. You have this spontaneous Medal of Honor ceremony where the First Lady presents the medal to this terminally ill far-right radio host, Rush Limbaugh. So in some way, Nancy was very aware of who she's dealing with, and she literally did steal the headlines and steal the show. It wasn't like this moment just happened out of nowhere. It started early in the night where he presented the speech to her, and whether he saw it or not, he failed to shake her hand. And then throughout the night, you had all kinds of eye rolling and other reactions of her behind him. So the tear was more a culmination than anything else.
The whole framing of this one event, the ripping up of the speech, can't be understood really, I don't think, unless you situate it not only in the context of the fact that Trump was recently impeached by that body in that room, but also this very visual public animosity that has played out between the Speaker of the House and the President for the last few years. We have talked about the famous image from last year's State of the Union of the Nancy clap, where Nancy Pelosi appeared to be sort of throwing Trump a bone and, pretending to clap for something relatively bipartisan. That became a meme. And then more recently, last October, a photograph that was actually made by a White House photographer and released by Trump himself showed Pelosi literally standing up to Trump, pointing her finger at him, making a very particular point just before she left a very contentious meeting on Syria. So this moment of her ripping the speech really has to be understood in the context of all of those other visual moments that chronicle their ongoing, very antagonistic relationship.
I think we can call it the Trump-Pelosi trilogy at this point, wouldn't you say?
The danger of that, of course, is that the significance of the impeachment itself and then the significance of Trump's, kind of creation of this reality TV spectacle might get lost. But in the image wars, Nancy appeared to very much have the last word. In the segment we call The Look, we're interested in how news photos push the boundaries to illustrate a story or an idea.
This photo was taken by Antara Photo via Reuters, and it documents the spreading of the coronavirus outside China. You see medical officials spraying Indonesian nationals with antiseptic after they arrived from Wuhan, China, before being transferred to quarantine at an Indonesian airbase.
I'm really struck by the contrast between the people in the hazmat suits and the people coming down the stairway with simple masks on their faces. It really prompts thinking about who's protecting who needs to be safe from who. I'm also very aware of what appears to be the gender of most of the folks coming off of the plane. They appear to be primarily women and children, and that to me is striking as well.
It's actually a kind of a quirky shot with the flying hair and beautiful colors, the pink, the yellow, the green. And I think that the use of novelty, humor, art in this case is something that we're seeing more often because how else do we cope with this terrifying climate and now health crises that are rocking our world?
The quirkiness comes in the spray and the hair that's askew, and the woman in the front, her eyes are closed. Obviously, she's trying not to get something sprayed in her eyes. She's clearly performing some sort of body posture that they've demanded that these folks perform when they spray them. But the spray itself seems to me to be almost a kind of metaphor. And so the question is, a metaphor for what? Anxiety, xenophobia? Does the spray stand in for the lack of something you might really need, which is a way to systematically detect who has and hasn't been exposed, who isn't ill? Is the spray overkill? Just the presence of the spray and the very, very institutionalized figures in the hazmat suit makes you wonder whether what is happening needs to happen and what isn't happening because this is happening instead.
It's a really interesting point about the overkill and trying to assess the intervention here, especially when you think about the stories that are coming out of China about really repressive tactics, locking people in their homes and locking down Wuhan, the whole entire city, attacking people who don't have masks on. And in some ways, too, with the whole conflict between China and Hong Kong and all these leaderless democracy movements around the world, the impact of the water cannon. So it's true, there's like a chilling aspect to this and some confusion given all the different acts of repression and all these troubles that we're dealing with. And yes, the other point you made about the mask is really rising at this point to the symbol of our age.
Yeah, we've got the masks that people wear in the context of wildfires. We've got the masks that people are wearing in this context. Part of, I think, the power of the mask is tied to mobility and travel. So if you look at a lot of these coronavirus images, a lot of them are tied to anxieties about people who might have been infected in Wuhan moving around the world. And we are in a world where mobility is common, and there's a lot of anxiety about who is coming and going and what, quote unquote, they might be bringing in with them or along with them. And so it's this idea that with mobility and travel becomes danger. So then the solution becomes to limit that mobility and travel. So the folks in Indonesia, it's my understanding that these folks were actually going to be quarantined on an Indonesian island. They are going from mobility to immobility very quickly here.
The larger issue is that this photograph reinforces this trend towards xenophobia and limits on immigration that we're seeing domestically here for sure, and then also around the world.
The other thing that images like this call forth, I think, is a kind of acknowledgement of histories of public health anxieties. So we can talk about more recently things like SARS or the swine flu. We can also talk about things like AIDS, where there was at a certain point a lot of hysteria, a lot of misinformation, a lot of stigma as the result of those things. And so these photos also in the future may be looked at as examples of yet another kind of public health anxiety being performed in a context where we really didn't know what we were dealing with. Our next segment we call the pick, and here we're interested in what makes a photo a good editorial choice among many options.
This photo was taken by Samuel Coram for Getty, and if you're looking for one photograph that really captures the Senate impeachment trial, I think this is it. It was taken in the Senate hallway, and if you recall, Lamar Alexander there on the right was the deciding vote on whether to call witnesses or not. To have called witnesses would have made the whole process more wide open, more damning, maybe more like an actual trial. The New Yorker caption, which are always interesting, and they're not really captions, but they're commentaries or extensions of their story, said in this case, perhaps Lamar Alexander has done us all a favor. The Trump impeachment trial will be over and we will no longer have to listen to it.
Especially in the era of fake news and the fostering of anxieties about whether you can trust the media, the press still largely functions and should function as the fourth estate, as the gateway for citizens to have access, public access to leaders and officials and information. And one of the things this photograph does is point out the extent to which that has been rejected, not only by this process, but by the president whose actions prompted this process. So that very, very crowded left side of the frame of this photograph, they're reaching out in desperation because they're behind a velvet rope that's pinning them back there, that's keeping them from being able to walk up and follow Senator Alexander down the hall and ask him questions about why he decided to do what he did. And so that leaning, that stretching of those bodies and the microphones and the phones and the cameras, to me, really illustrates that distance between what the public's right to know is or should be and the way that this entire process has played out, not just behind closed doors, but just in a really openly antagonistic way to any ideals of public communication.
Absolutely. This whole process, besides being empty in itself, was also an astonishing act of visual censorship. Something on the level of canceling the Merrick Garland nomination. Not only does the photo say no questions asked, but what it also does is refer to what was happening visually or not happening visually inside the chamber, where there was a stationary camera operated by the Senate, not even C-SPAN, where you saw almost nothing.
I can't help but think about the symbolism of Lamar Alexander's relatively, I would say, casual attire. He may or may not have a tie on underneath that suit jacket. He's wearing a sweater. He's literally a guy who's retiring. He's not coming back. He's not running for re-election. And so that symbolism of him walking away, carrying an envelope, he's literally turning his back on the press, the people asking him questions. He's also literally kind of on his way out the door. And so to have this be his last act seems, at least to me, to be really symbolic of that kind of dissociation that's played out in the process up to this point. Well, that's it for us this week, folks.
You can find us on readingthepictures.org and also on Instagram and on our Twitter feed.
Thanks for joining us.